She had always trusted him. For 15 years, Laura and her husband Mark seemed like the perfect couple, the kind that others envied. The house, vacations, and unbreakable connection had seen them through life's ups and downs. But all of that changed in a single night, with a discovery that turned her world inside out. It began with something small. Mark had become distant lately, distracted even when they were together. Laura noticed the late nights at the office becoming more frequent, the casual excuses piling up. "It's just work," he'd say with a weary smile, but the smile never reached his eyes anymore. She pushed the thought aside and tried to silence the small voice in her head that whispered there was more to the story. She trusted him, of course she did, until she found that box tucked away in the back of his closet, hidden under a pile of old clothes. She reached for it, her hand trembling with an unease she couldn't shake off. As she opened the lid, her heart sank. Inside lay a velvet jewelry case and a set of photographs. They were not hers. Every assumption she had about her life, her marriage, began to unravel right there. Her pulse quickened as she realized. As Laura stared at the contents of the box, a sinking feeling overwhelmed her. More than the jewelry case or the photos, it was the realization that her world may not be what she thought. She remembered the early days of their relationship and how Mark had swept her off her feet with grand gestures and promises of forever. He had been the one constant in her life, the one person she believed would never hurt her. But now, with every second she spent looking at those photos, it felt like the man she loved was a stranger she'd never truly known. Laura sank to the floor, trying to make sense of it all. The jewelry box contained a bracelet, something elegant and expensive, definitely not a piece she had ever seen or worn. The photographs were even more damning. Mark, arm in arm with a woman much younger than Laura. The smiles on their faces weren't the polite kind shared between acquaintances or coworkers. They were the kind of smiles that spoke of intimacy, of something much deeper than friendship. She could feel the walls closing in around her as memories flooded back. Moments she had dismissed as insignificant suddenly felt laden with meaning. Like that business trip last summer when he had come home acting distant for days, or the times he seemed to be texting someone late at night but claimed it was just a work email. All those small moments, the little red flags she had ignored or brushed off, now formed a bigger picture, and it was ugly. The questions raced through her mind, each one more painful than the last. How long had this been going on? Who was the woman in the photos? Why had Mark hidden this from her? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, had she ever truly known him? Laura's hands shook as she placed the items back in the box and closed it. She needed answers, but she wasn't sure if she could handle the truth. Her instincts screamed at her to confront Mark right away, but part of her wasn't ready to hear whatever excuse he might offer. What if he lied again? Or worse, what if he told her the truth and it was even more devastating than she feared? The clock on the bedroom wall ticked loudly, filling the silence with a rhythmic reminder that time was passing. But Laura remained frozen, torn between the urge to scream and the need to keep her emotions in check. She stood up slowly, placed the box back where she had found it, and walked out of the room. For now, she would keep this discovery to herself. She needed time to think, process, and decide what she was going to do next. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The secret she had uncovered was merely the first crack in a facade that was about to come crashing down, and with it, everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Over the next few days, Laura found herself looking at Mark differently. Every word he said, every gesture he made, it all felt rehearsed, like he was playing a part in a script she hadn't been given. She couldn't get the image of those photographs out of her mind. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but the way Mark held her told a story she couldn't ignore. The ease in their body language suggested more than a passing acquaintance. Laura decided she needed answers, but she knew she couldn't just come out and confront him. Not yet. So she started to pay closer attention. The late-night phone calls, the urgent meetings that seemed to crop up out of nowhere, the way he would avoid making eye contact when talking about his day, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even realized she was putting together. She tried to remind herself that she could be overreacting, that maybe there was a simple explanation for everything, but her gut told her otherwise. Then, one evening, while they were watching TV, Mark's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He reached for it quickly, his thumb covering the screen before Laura could get a glimpse of the message. His reaction was subtle, just a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, but it was enough to make Laura's heart race. She asked casually, "Who's texting you so late?" Mark shrugged, not looking up from his phone. "Just work stuff," he said, too quickly. "You know how it is." He placed the phone back on the table face down, and Laura's suspicion deepened. She hadn't seen Mark act this way before. He was always open with his phone, never one to hide messages or suddenly be so guarded about who was contacting him. From that moment on, Laura began to notice other things she hadn't picked up on before. The scent of unfamiliar perfume lingering on his clothes, receipts from restaurants she hadn't visited with him, and the way he seemed to be making an effort to stay out later than usual. When she would ask him about his day, his stories were vague. The details didn't quite add up, and the excuses seemed rehearsed. Each time she pressed for more information, he would quickly change the subject or give her that same tired line. "It's just work." Laura's mind raced with possibilities. Was this woman in the photographs the only secret he was keeping? She didn't want to believe that Mark, the man she had built a life with, was capable of betraying her in such a way. Yet, with every passing day, her doubts grew stronger. The harder she tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, the clearer it became that she wasn't. Determined to find out the truth, Laura decided to start digging a little deeper. She began by checking their credit card statements for unusual charges, places she hadn't heard of, and dates that didn't match up with his usual schedule. Each new discovery added fuel to the fire burning inside her, a fire that now consumed her every thought. She knew she was on the edge of uncovering something significant, but whether she was prepared for what she might find was another question entirely. The more she looked, the more it felt like Mark had built an entirely different life right under her nose. She was about to find out just how deep the lies went, and with each new clue, the line between truth and deception grew blurrier. Laura's investigation was beginning to take a toll on her. Sleepless nights spent poring over details and nagging doubts left her exhausted, but she knew she couldn't stop now. She had to keep pushing forward, even if the truth turned out to be more than she could handle. One afternoon, when Mark was away at a supposed business meeting, Laura found herself alone in the house. Her mind kept drifting back to that hidden box in the closet, and she felt an overwhelming urge to search for more. Her heart raced as she made her way to their bedroom, feeling a mixture of dread and determination. She opened the closet door and carefully sifted through Mark's belongings, half expecting to find nothing. But then, behind a row of old suits and buried beneath a pile of dusty shoes, she found something else, a small, nondescript black notebook. It looked old, worn around the edges, like it had been carried around for quite some time. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to flip through the pages. What she saw made her stomach drop. The notebook was filled with dates, locations, and cryptic notes. At first, it was hard to make sense of, but as she read on, a pattern emerged. The entries matched up with times Mark had claimed to be out of town for work or staying late at the office. Besides certain dates were names that didn't belong to any colleagues she knew, and one name kept appearing more than the others. Megan. Laura's mind raced. Who was Megan? The name wasn't familiar, and Mark had never mentioned anyone by that name before. As she flipped further through the pages, she found what seemed to be a record of expenses. Hotel names, dinners at upscale restaurants, even notes on gifts, like the bracelet she had found in the box. Her hands grew clammy as she realized that this wasn't just evidence of one affair, but of an entire secret life he had kept hidden from her. With each page, the gravity of Mark's betrayal deepened. The notebook wasn't just proof of his infidelity. It was a detailed account of his deception stretching back over a year. She had always thought that if something like this ever happened, she would know, she would sense it. But looking at the pages in front of her, she realized just how skilled Mark had been at covering his tracks, how many times she had taken his excuses at face value. Just as she was about to close the notebook, a loose piece of paper fell out, landing softly on the carpet. It was a letter, written in Mark's handwriting, addressed to Megan. As she read the words, Laura felt a wave of nausea wash over her. It wasn't just the intimacy of the words or the promises of a future together that hurt the most. It was the casual way Mark spoke about her, as if their life together had become nothing more than an inconvenience. For a moment, Laura sat there, paralyzed by a mix of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. But as the initial shock wore off, a new emotion took over: resolve. She wasn't going to sit idly by while Mark lied to her face and lived a double life. The time for playing detective was over. It was time for him to explain himself. And this time, there would be no hiding behind half-truths or excuses. That evening, Laura could barely keep her composure as she waited for Mark to come home. The weight of the evidence she had uncovered, those notes, the bracelet, the letter, pressed heavily on her chest. She replayed every moment in her mind, planning what she would say, how she would confront him. But as she heard his keys jingling at the front door, a wave of emotion surged through her, threatening to unravel the calm facade she had been struggling to maintain. Mark entered the living room with his usual distracted air, barely glancing at her as he set his bag down. "Long day," he muttered, loosening his tie. Laura took a deep breath, clenching the black notebook behind her back. "We need to talk, Mark," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He looked up, finally meeting her eyes, and for a split second, she saw something flicker across his face. Was it guilt or just surprise? "What's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. Laura stepped forward and placed the notebook on the coffee table, the letter lying atop it like a damning accusation. "You tell me," she replied, unable to keep the bitterness from seeping into her voice. "Explain this." Mark's expression shifted as he glanced at the items on the table. His eyes narrowed, and he reached for the notebook, flipping through it quickly. "Where did you find this?" he asked, but there was no shock in his voice, no denial, only a guarded defensiveness that confirmed everything Laura had feared. "Is that all you have to say?" Laura shot back. "Where I found it? Not an apology, not an explanation? Who is Megan, Mark? How long have you been lying to me?" For a moment, he just stood there, his mouth opening and closing as if he were searching for the right words to say. But Laura could see it now, the truth etched on his face. Finally, he let out a breath and sank into the armchair. "It's not what you think," he began, but she cut him off. "It's exactly what I think," she said, her voice rising. "This isn't just some misunderstanding, Mark. You've been leading a double life, lying to me, betraying me. For what? For who?" Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for showing that weakness, for letting him see how deeply his betrayal had wounded her. Mark ran a hand through his hair, avoiding her gaze. "It was a mistake," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "A mistake?" Laura's voice was incredulous. "This has been going on for over a year. You call that a mistake?" She felt a surge of anger coursing through her, propelling her towards him. "You lied to me every day. You planned this out. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a choice, one you made over and over again." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. Mark seemed at a loss for how to respond, and for a moment the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Laura took a step back, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. "I don't even know who you are anymore," she whispered, more to herself than to him. After a long pause, Mark stood up, reaching for her. "Laura, please." But she pulled away, shaking her head. "Don't," she said, her voice steady now, colder than it had been. "You've already said enough." The aftermath of the confrontation left Laura feeling drained, a hollow emptiness settling where the anger had been. Over the next few days, she moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding Mark as much as she could. They exchanged few words, and when they did, it was as if they were talking through a wall of glass, unable to truly reach one another. Eventually, Laura packed a suitcase. She needed time away, a chance to think without being surrounded by the remnants of a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else. As she closed the door behind her, she wasn't sure if she was leaving for a few days or forever. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. A week had passed since Laura walked out, and she hadn't spoken to Mark once. She had been staying with her sister, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the silence only seemed to make her questions louder. She wasn't just grappling with the betrayal. She was haunted by the feeling that there was still more she didn't know. The pieces just didn't quite fit together. The secrecy in Mark's behavior and the things she found hinted at something larger, something she hadn't yet uncovered. One afternoon, while clearing out her inbox, Laura stumbled upon an email notification she hadn't seen before, one that came from a cloud storage service Mark used for work. It was a shared folder she hadn't accessed in years, back when they occasionally used it to store vacation photos and documents. Curiosity piqued. Laura opened the link, not expecting much, just a few old memories maybe. But what she found inside made her blood run cold. The folder contained a series of documents that were entirely unrelated to work or anything she could have expected. There were financial records, contracts, and personal notes, all pointing to a hidden bank account. The account was in Mark's name but had significant transactions linked to a woman named Megan, and not just one woman. It seemed that Megan was not an individual at all, but a code name Mark had used for multiple women, each associated with different accounts, payments, and gifts. Laura's hands trembled as she scrolled through the files. She found receipts for hotel bookings in different cities, expensive jewelry purchased from high-end stores, and transfers that couldn't be explained away as business expenses. It was clear that Mark had been living a life filled with deceit, using the pseudonym Megan to cover his tracks with not one but several affairs. The sheer extent of his deception was overwhelming. As if that wasn't enough, Laura found one more document buried deep in the folder, an unsigned legal agreement. It was a draft of a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, between Mark and a woman named Cassandra. In the document, there was a clause detailing a substantial payment, seemingly in exchange for her silence about their relationship. The dates on the draft coincided with the period when Mark had started acting distant, which meant that not only was he having multiple affairs, but he was also prepared to pay to keep at least one of them secret. The revelation hit Laura like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a calculated series of lies, hidden lives, and attempts to protect his reputation at any cost. She could hardly believe the lengths Mark had gone to deceive her. It was no longer just about their marriage or even about Megan. It was about who Mark truly was and the web of manipulation he had woven around her for so long. Determined not to let him get away with this, Laura reached out to Cassandra. If this NDA draft was real, then Cassandra might know more than anyone else about what had been going on behind the scenes. It took a few days and several unanswered messages before Cassandra finally replied, agreeing to meet and talk. What she revealed in that conversation would change everything Laura thought she knew about her husband. As they sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, Cassandra confessed that she wasn't just some fling. She had been involved with Mark for nearly 3 years, long before Laura found that first box in the closet. But the most shocking revelation was this. Mark had lied to Cassandra too. He had told her that he was in the process of divorcing Laura, that the marriage was in name only, and that they were staying together for the sake of their reputation. The betrayal cut deeper than Laura could have ever imagined. Mark hadn't just cheated on her. He had built an elaborate life filled with layers of lies, not only to keep his affairs hidden from her, but also to deceive the women he was seeing. The discovery that he had been willing to go to such extremes to maintain his double life left her reeling, but it also gave her a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice and reclaiming the truth. The more she learned, the more determined she became to ensure Mark faced the consequences of the world he had built on lies. With the truth now laid bare, Laura realized that confronting Mark was no longer about salvaging their marriage. It was about reclaiming her life and ensuring that he faced the consequences of his actions. She knew that she couldn't simply walk away without a fight. The lies had gone on for too long, and the damage he had caused went far beyond their relationship. The time had come to take control. Laura's first step was to consult with a lawyer. Armed with the evidence she had collected, the notebook, the financial records, the unsigned NDA, and even the conversation with Cassandra, she prepared herself for the legal battle that was sure to come. Her attorney assured her that she had a strong case for divorce, and given the nature of Mark's deceit, she could pursue a substantial settlement. But Laura wanted more than just financial compensation. She needed Mark to know that his web of lies was coming undone. At the lawyer's suggestion, Laura had Mark served with divorce papers at his office, a very public gesture to ensure that he couldn't hide behind his usual facade. The shock on his face when the papers were delivered was the first victory in what would be a long fight. Mark reached out to her immediately, pleading to talk things over, to handle the situation privately, but Laura stood her ground. She wasn't going to be swept under the rug this time. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, and during that time, Laura found herself discovering new aspects of her own strength. She began to reconnect with friends she had lost touch with during the turmoil of her marriage, people who offered her support and reminded her of the life she once had. With every day that passed, she felt herself growing more confident, more certain that leaving Mark had been the right decision. But Mark wasn't giving up easily. He tried to manipulate the narrative, suggesting that Laura was overreacting, that they could still work things out. At one point, he even proposed signing the NDA to make things right. But Laura was beyond making deals. She wasn't interested in silence. She wanted closure, not more lies. In the final stages of the divorce, a settlement was reached. Laura secured the house as well as a considerable portion of their shared assets, but the most important victory wasn't material. It was the sense of liberation that came from no longer being tied to Mark's secrets. She had uncovered the truth, fought for her dignity, and come out on the other side stronger than she had ever imagined. Yet, even as the legal battles came to an end, there was one last thing Laura needed to do. She wrote a letter to Cassandra, thanking her for coming forward and wishing her the best in moving on from the whole ordeal. Laura didn't know if Cassandra would ever forgive Mark, or even if she should, but she hoped that, like her, Cassandra could find a way to rebuild her life. With the past now behind her, Laura stood in front of the mirror one morning and saw herself in a way she hadn't in years. There was a calmness in her reflection, a quiet strength that had been forged in the fire of betrayal. She was no longer the woman who needed to question her husband's every word or search for hidden clues. She was free. As she stepped out of the house for the last time, she took a deep breath. It wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. The pain had been real, the betrayal profound, but in the end, she had found something she hadn't realized she was missing all along. Herself. If you found Laura's story compelling and felt every twist and turn as she uncovered the truth, don't forget to show your support by hitting the like button. It helps us bring you more stories just like this. What would you do if you were in Laura's shoes? Would you confront your partner, seek legal advice, or choose a different path entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you're interested in more stories of resilience, betrayal, and the search for truth, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We've got more gripping tales coming your way that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And if you have your own story that you'd like to share, feel free to reach out. Your story could be the next one we bring to life.